going to welcome Esther up now. I was thinking about this earlier, Esther. I think I've known you for nearly 20 years, which means we're both getting old. But it's wonderful to have Esther with us today. She is going to be speaking on our series on Sabbath. So I'll pray for you, Esther, if that's all right. Father God, we thank you for Esther. Thank you for the time that she's put in just to prepare this talk, time with you, time studying your word. And I just pray now you'd fill her with your spirit as she shares with us what you've put on her heart. And I pray, that you would give us open hearts and ears to what you have to say through her this afternoon. Amen.
Thank you. Well, we are continuing to think about Sabbath today. And I don't know, have any of you had a really restful week? A week of Sabbath rest? I have to say, I began my week last Sunday listening to the talk on Sabbath down at Community Church. And I walked out of that and got in my car and strife began. I have two small children who are adopted, who are very close in age and who love to fight. And the week has been a bit like that. And it's been challenging to think about Sabbath in the midst of chaos and strife. But it has also been a helpful thing. So last week we began the series by thinking about... That one. Thinking about how the idea of Sabbath comes from the story of creation and the seventh day of creation where God stopped work and rested. And this idea that this seventh day is a picture of how it is meant to be, as it should be-ness. And in this we have harmony between God and man and the earth. And this picture is then developed in the rest of the Bible in the idea of Sabbath. So we have the big picture. We have creation at the beginning, moving all the way around through the Bible to the picture at the end, which is also a picture of a garden and God dwelling with men, and the harmony between God and men and the earth. But in between we have a bit of a journey. So we have what Dave Roderick termed last week, day 8, when it all went wrong. When we go from harmony to strife. Then we have the whole of the Old Testament, which is the story of God's people finding again that place of walking with God. But that didn't work, and we again are back into strife. Then we have Jesus. Now, I get today to preach the bit about Sabbath from the Old Testament, and I've been given the book of Leviticus. Now, I did think, what is the point of going back to the Old Testament when we know that the answer is Jesus? That Jesus brings us rest, that he's the one that we need to trust, and he brings us that place of walking with God again. But actually, the Old Testament has such riches in it that speak to us about the fullness of who Jesus was going to be and what he was going to bring. And I can get really familiar with the story of Jesus. But when I delve into some of the unfamiliar stuff in the Old Testament, it actually gives me a deeper knowledge of him and what he came to do. So that's what we're going to do today. So let's move on to Leviticus. Anyone read Leviticus recently? No? I have to say, Leviticus is one of the hardest books of the Bible to read, isn't it? It is full of stuff that we don't really get. It's full of rules and regulations and sacrifices and all this stuff that is not kind of fitting with our culture and that we don't really understand. And I used to struggle through Leviticus as I read through the Bible in a year sometimes and just want to get it over and done with. But then I did some study and I got to write an essay on Leviticus. And instead of reading it, I started reading the people that had studied it really deeply and knew what it was all about and understood the Hebrew. And I actually discovered that the message of Leviticus is such a beautiful message. It is this idea that God wanted to come and live amongst his people like a neighbour and walk amongst them once again. So we start the book of Leviticus and we find this place called the tabernacle, the tent of meeting, that God instructed his people to build. And God came into this tabernacle, and his presence was there. But there was a problem. The people could not approach it. So we find at the beginning of Leviticus, you have God in the tabernacle, and Moses is standing outside at a distance, and God is speaking to him. Well, by the end of the book, and at the beginning of the next book, the book of Numbers, we find the words, and Moses was in the tent of meeting. Over the course of the book of Leviticus, through all its rules and regulations, somehow God makes a way for Moses to be able to stand in his very presence, to be near him. So the bit of Leviticus that we're looking at today is, of course, the bit about the Sabbath rules. I'm going to read you a bit of it, and then we're going to think about what does that mean for us, who know the answer is Jesus, but who struggle to live in that relationship with Jesus. Can this help us? Leviticus 23. The Lord said to Moses, "Speak to the Israelites and say to them, these are my appointed festivals, the appointed festivals of the Lord, which you are to proclaim as sacred assemblies. There are 6 days when you may work, but the 7th day is a day of Sabbath rest, a day of sacred assembly. You are not to do any work. Wherever you live, it is a Sabbath to the Lord. These are the Lord's appointed festivals, the sacred assemblies you are to proclaim at the appointed times. The Lord's Passover begins at twilight on the 14th day of the first month, and on the 15th day of that month, the Lord's festival of unleavened bread begins. For 7 days you must eat bread made without yeast. On the first day, hold a sacred assembly and do no regular work. For 7 days, present a food offering to the Lord, and on the 7th day, hold a sacred assembly and do no regular work." And the rest of chapter 23 is a description of the 7 festivals that the people of God were to celebrate. So there's the festival of the Passover, when they celebrate God rescuing them from Egypt. And then followed by the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the festival of the first fruits, and the festival of weeks, or Pentecost as it's also called. Both of those celebrated God's provision. Then we have the festival of trumpets, where trumpets were blown. The Day of Atonement, where the high priest would lay his hands on a goat and send it into the wilderness to carry away the sins of the people. And finally, the festival of tabernacles, where the Israelites were instructed to spend a week living in tents made out of branches from beautiful trees, and to spend that time celebrating. And then that's Leviticus 23, and we go on to Leviticus 25 next, and that carries on talking about Sabbath. So Leviticus 25. The Lord said to Moses again, "Speak to the Israelites and say to them, when you enter the land I am going to give you, the land itself must observe a Sabbath for the Lord. For 6 years now, for 6 years sow your fields, and for 6 years prune your vineyards and gather their crops. But in the 7th year, the land is to have a Sabbath rest, a Sabbath to the Lord. Do not sow your fields or prune your vineyards. Do not reap what grows of itself or harvest the grapes of your untended vines. The land is to have a year of rest." I'll skip a little bit, and then it says, "Count off 7 Sabbath years, 7 times 7 years, so that the 7 Sabbath years amount to a period of 49 years. Then have a trumpet sounded everywhere on the 10th day of the 7th month, the Day of Atonement. Sound the trumpet throughout your land, and consecrate the 50th year, and proclaim liberty throughout the land to all its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee to you. Each of you is to return to your family property and to your own clan. The 50th year shall be a jubilee for you." So in these passages we have a lot of 7s and a lot of stopping. To sum it up, the people of God were to stop every 7th day, and then over the year they were to celebrate 7 festivals, which each consisted of either 1 day or 7 days. And then every 7th year they were to stop completely for a whole year. And then every 7 times 7 years they were to continue that stopping for a whole another year. An ultimate Sabbath rest called the Jubilee. Now from last week we know that the number 7 points back to that 7th day of creation, that day where God and man walked together in the garden. So there's something here in all this Sabbath stopping that's meant to direct us back to that relationship between God and man. It's a lot of stopping for a people that relied on the land for their living. I don't know if any of you here have watched any programs about farming or maybe done some farming yourself. Farmers don't stop work. They have to get up every day. They have to care for their crops. They have to care for the land. But for God's people, it was to be different. Now, I don't know about any of you that have children, but my children are allergic to the word stop. They just don't understand it, and they don't obey it. In fact, if I say stop in my household, one of 2 things happens. Either things escalate, so shouting goes to screaming, screaming goes to hitting, hitting goes to kicking, kicking goes to being on top of each other, punching each other, and then I lose it. It's not a pretty picture. Or the other thing that happens, which I really don't understand, is you say stop to one child, and the other child immediately starts doing the thing that you've told the first child to stop. And I have a little inkling that my children don't seem to understand the word stop because they want to be in control. They don't want to give up whatever it is they've decided to do to give control back to me. For the people of God, they were instructed to stop. And I expect that something in them probably rebelled against it, like it does in my children. And when we think about the things that we have done with Sabbath rest, the things that we have made it, we've made it all about the stopping. But actually we ought to have made it all about the reasons that they were called to stop. So we're going to just consider why God called his people to do all this stopping. And what's important is not the stopping, but the reasons behind it. And from Leviticus, we've got 3 really key reasons. I'm pressing the wrong thing. The first reason they were asked to stop is to stop to reorientate. God wanted them to live lives in such a way that they had a rhythm where they were constantly pulling their eyes back to him, back to dependence on God, back to the fact that they didn't have to control everything for themselves. Now, I ask my children to stop because I love them and I want to shape their lives well. But actually they think I'm asking them to stop because they think that I want the control. And actually we can be a bit like that with God. We can resist stopping because we're not quite ready to give him the control. But actually it's a good thing to stop. It's a good thing to stop and pause whenever we can and lift our eyes back to God. I've been trying to practice this week. I've been trying to, whenever I'm about to say stop, just go, actually I don't have to do this on my own. God is my partner in my parenting. God is my partner in my work. God is my partner when I look at the world and think, I can't make sense of this mess. Actually, I don't have to do it alone. And reorientating ourselves back to him helps us to have grace in what we're dealing with. The second reason they were called to stop is to stop to remember and to celebrate. Every year in January, I pull together a photo book for each of my children of the year before, and I put in a book all the best photos. And as I do it, it astounds me how much fun we've had and how much joy we have had in the year. Because I'm a bit of a pessimist, I get to the end of a year and I go, that was an awful year. It's been a real struggle. It's been really hard. But actually, when I look back and when I remember, I see that it hasn't all been bad. There has been so much joy. And each of the festivals that they stopped to celebrate reminded the people of God's provision for them and the way that God had rescued them. As they stopped to remember and to celebrate, they acted out their story And as they acted it out, it brought them back into that place of walking with God and being in relationship with him. So we're called to stop and remember. Stop and remember the big story we're part of. Stop and remember our stories, what God has done for us. And as we remember, we can celebrate. And as we celebrate, we bring his kingdom on earth as it is in heaven. The final stop. In each of these calls to Sabbath rest, it's not just about the people of God. It's about all the people around them. It's about the earth. And it's about releasing others. So on the Sabbath, they were called to, stop work on the Sabbath, not just for themselves, but so that their servants and the people that worked for them got a rest. They were called to have a Sabbath rest from the land so that the land had a rest and could rejuvenate itself and serve them well. And that final, every 50 years, the year of Jubilee, it's a beautiful picture of releasing others, of freeing them from their debts and setting them free. When we think about the words that are used in the Old Testament for release, it's a Hebrew word called deror. And this is echoed in the New Testament by a word that's translated forgiveness. So often, God calls us to stop, to consider, and to release people in forgiveness. Because it frees them from their debt and their burden and bondage. And it's not just an individual thing. I've been thinking a lot recently about collective sin and the way that people are burdened by the sins of our society. Well, as Christians, we're called to release them, to live lives that stop, that consider how we're living, and live in a way that releases others from debt, from slavery, from poverty, and from oppression. Actually, in all the rules and regulations in Leviticus, there's a central verse that seems not to fit. And it's a verse that you know well. It's love your neighbour as you love yourself. It's slotted in there, and it seems a bit random. This is all about holiness. This is all about my relationship with God and how I walk with God. But actually, the secret to walking well with God is in serving and loving others. And somehow in this, he brings us to a place of rest. For the people of God in Leviticus, there was consequences to how they chose to live. Chapter 26 lists blessings and curses of what would happen to the people of God if they lived by God's rules or if they didn't. If they lived by God's rules, God said, I will put my dwelling place among you, and I will not abhor you, I will not hate you. I will walk among you and be your God, and you will be my people. The promise of blessing is taking the people back to Eden, back to that seventh day of rest, where they were in harmony with God, with each other, and with the earth. And sadly, the consequences of not living God's way, well, your land will be laid waste and your cities will lie in ruins. The land will get to enjoy its Sabbath years of all the times that it lies desolate, and you are in the country of your enemies. We know the story of exile. I'd never connected before how, when the people of God were taken into exile, their land got its Sabbath rest. It got the rest that the people had neglected to give it. It was able to rejuvenate and not be tilled year after year after year. Fortunately, we know that's not the end of the story. Next year, we're going to be thinking about Jesus and the Sabbath. But actually, I'm just going to give you a sneak preview, and you get it in there, and I hope I don't spoil whoever's talk it is next week. But Jesus begins his ministry standing in the synagogue on the Sabbath day and proclaiming a year of Jubilee. The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to preach the good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to release the oppressed and proclaim the year of the Lord's favour. Jesus was proclaiming that now was the time for that super Sabbath rest, the Jubilee, which was promised years and years and years ago in the Old Testament, in Leviticus. He brought the time of release. He brought the time of walking with God. He brought the time of favour. As I was thinking about these rules in Leviticus and the rhythms of stopping, the phrase that came to me was a phrase from the Message version of Matthew. The unforced rhythms of grace. We can read the Old Testament and we can think it's really strict, it's really like rule-based, but actually God didn't intend it like that. He called the people to stop because he wanted to be in relationship with them. And Jesus calls us to the same thing. He says, are you tired and worn out and burned out on religion? Sounds like someone that's trying to follow the Sabbath for the sake of following the rules and not for the heart behind it. He says, come to me, get away with me and recover your life. I'll show you how to take a real rest. Learn the unforced rhythms of grace. I won't lay anything heavy or ill-fitting on you. Keep company with me and you'll learn to live freely and lightly. We all have rhythms of life. We're not Israelite peasant farmers of the ancient world. We have our own rhythms. But how do we incorporate these rhythms so that we can stop and remember our stories? So that we can stop and reorient ourselves back to God? And so that we can stop and release freedom to others? As we live these rhythms out in whatever way God calls us to do them, we find rest in the presence of God. One day, and I look forward to it, we will have it perfectly. But as we live out these rhythms of grace now, we bring that perfect ending into our daily lives. Let's pray. God, our lives feel busy and sometimes it feels impossible to stop. But we acknowledge that we can always stop and turn our eyes to you, even in the moments. We can always practice remembering and celebrating our stories. And we can always live our lives in a way that releases others to freedom. I thank you that when we walk in these rhythms that you mapped out so long ago, we find we're not doing it alone. We're doing it with you walking beside us, bringing heaven down to earth, bringing your kingdom now as we long for it to be. So I pray that you would help us to get away from the rules of stopping and to find the grace behind it that calls us into relationship. Help us to walk in your ways this week and find rest.